Relationship with the helper. How people view their relationship with others has a profound impact on whether help seeking will be seen as supportive or threatening. Feelings of closeness with the potential helper, the nature of the pre-existing relationship with the person, and how people see themselves in relation to others critically shape these perceptions and ultimately determine whether people will ask others for assistance. Closeness. In general, people anticipate that others with whom they are close will be supportive. Therefore, when people do seek help, most commonly they approach someone who is similar to them and with whom they have a close relationship. Experiments consistently show that people are more likely to ask friends for help than strangers. This effect also occurs when the strangers are professionals who are trained to give assistance. According to Wills, 1992, people who seek help for psychological problems are about 2 to 5 times as likely to seek it from their friends, other family members, or other acquaintances as they are to seek it from professionals, even though the professionals may be better trained and more capable of effectively dealing with the problem. For example, Wills reported that people with personal or emotional problems were more than twice as likely to ask for informal help from people in their social support network than to ask for help from a professional. Even when people do seek organized formal support for a specific problem, they are as likely to join a self-help group comprised of people with the same problem, e.g., an alcoholic joining Alcoholics Anonymous, as they are to go to a professional who treats such problems. The reason for this effect of closeness on help seeking probably lies in the differences between the dynamics that exist in different kinds of relationships. Relationships can be classified as one of 2 types, exchange or communal. Clark and Mills, 1993, characterized exchange relationships as interactions in which the participant's behavior is largely controlled by economic considerations. People in such a relationship carefully consider the effort, i.e. costs, they will have to expend when they do something for another person, and they also fully expect that such actions will be reciprocated. Conversely, those in exchange relationships are aware that if the other person helps them, they will owe that person something in return. Think about your relationships with your boss, a classmate with whom you are working on a class project, or a person who lives down the hall from you in the dormitory. These may be examples of exchange relationships. In contrast, people in communal relationships are less interested in the costs and benefits associated with their actions and are more interested in the quality of the relationship and the well-being of the other person. Because the parties involved in the relationship care more about one another, they assume that kindness and favors will eventually be repaid, but they do not keep close track of who owes what to whom. Additionally, because people in a communal relationship know one another fairly well, they are more willing to let their guard down and are somewhat less concerned about someone ridiculing or rejecting them if they disclose something negative about themselves. In Nadler's 1987 experiment discussed earlier, the participants who needed help with academic problems probably correctly saw themselves as in an exchange relationship. Thus, they were reluctant to ask a stranger for help. To do so would have made them feel indebted to that person and, more importantly, concerned that the person would think less of them for asking for help. But in communal relationships, help seekers may feel that they can expose their weaknesses and problems to people like them, without a great deal of fear that they will suffer any negative consequences. Studies of homosexual men coping with their concerns about HIV and AIDS are supportive of this interpretation. Another characteristic of the potential helper that may influence help seekers' choices is their own status and abilities relative to those of another person. If help seekers are making the request primarily because they want the person to help them solve a problem and improve themselves, they will probably choose a helper with more competence, experience, or information about the matter at hand than they possess. In contrast, if people's self-esteem is seriously threatened by the problem and they want to bolster their self-image, they will probably select someone who has less experience or expertise than they, who is not doing as well as they are with the problem. If a person is threatened by a problem and chooses a helper of higher status or ability, This may produce what Will has called the paradox of help seeking. The person seeks help from someone who could threaten his or her self-image and causes further self-devaluation. What do people actually do when seeking help? Although laboratory experiments suggest a preference for lower status helpers, there is evidence from field studies that help seekers are also interested in finding someone who can actually help them solve their problem, and thus may strike a balance between the two options: successful problem solving and maintenance of a positive self-image. For example, Medvine, 1992, examined college students' preferences for selecting someone to help them with their academic and social problems. They were asked to choose between several different potential helpers. Among their choices were other students with the same problems as theirs, who were either better, worse, or equal to them in their ability to solve them, so-called similar peers; other students who did not have the same problems, but who did have formal training and expertise in solving these problems, trained paraprofessionals, and professional experts in the problem area. The students' choices reflected concern for both self-improvement and for their self-image. Specifically, the most frequent choice by far for a helper, 50% for academic problems, 58% for social problems, was a similar peer who was better at solving their problem than the help seekers. The most common reason the students gave for doing this was that it would lead to self-improvement. The fact that they chose the best peer supports this claim, but notice that they did not select the most qualified individuals, the paraprofessionals or the professionals. Medvine suggested that this preference represents a compromise between self-improvement and self-enhancement concerns. He further noted that this is the kind of choice usually found in field studies of help seeking. For example, when people join support groups such as Alcoholics Anonymous, they are given a sponsor, someone farther along in their treatment program, who is able to help them, but very soon the new members agree to serve as a sponsor themselves, helping someone not as far along in the recovery process as they are. The answer: summary and implications. In this chapter, we moved our focus from prosocial tendencies to the people who engage in prosocial actions and the people who receive them. We addressed three broad questions: what personal characteristics might be associated with the differences between people in their prosocial tendencies? What benefits, if any, accrue to people who engage in prosocial actions? What factors influence people's decisions to ask for help? With regard to the first of these issues, it does appear that a set of interrelated personality characteristics play an important role in individual differences in prosocial thoughts, feelings, and actions. That is, there is a convergence of findings across a fair number of different studies that leads us to conclude that A, there is such a thing as a prosocial personality, and B, differences in this personality attribute are associated with differences in prosocial actions that range from willingness to help a distressed individual to heroic rescues of people whose lives were in danger to willingness to serve as a volunteer. Some important qualifications must be placed on these findings, however. First, as we have pointed out several times, prosocial behaviors do not occur in a vacuum. Situational factors play a critical role in people's decisions to act or not act prosocially, and, more importantly, personal attributes and the characteristics of the situation interact to affect what a person thinks, feels, and does. In sum, one cannot focus just on personality or just on situational variables if one wants to understand fully prosocial responses. Second, almost all of the findings regarding the personality correlates of prosocial actions are correlational. Thus, one must be very cautious about inferring cause and effect relations from these correlations. For example, the relatively consistent findings of relationships between certain personality traits and volunteering could be due to the impact of volunteering on people's self-reports of their personality characteristics. That is, they could describe themselves as prosocial because they are volunteers, rather than vice versa. Thus, until there is a body of research that consistently shows that differences in personality traits precede and predict differences in volunteering, we cannot be sure what is cause and what is effect. Does personality make one volunteer, or does volunteering make one have a more prosocial personality? Finally, even if causality is established, Research is still needed on the specific mechanisms that link prosocial attributes with prosocial actions. It is not enough to show that personality predicts prosocial responses. It is also necessary to understand why this relationship exists. What are the processes that turn prosocial personal traits into prosocial actions? Some of the same problems in making causal inferences are present in the research on the consequences of prosocial actions for the people who perform them. There seems to be little question that there is a positive relationship across a wide variety of kinds of helping and kinds of helpers between people's willingness to volunteer and similar behaviors and outcomes ranging from academic achievement and occupational success to psychological health and feelings of well-being to physical health. The critical question again is whether volunteering is the cause or the effect of these relationships. However, in this instance, it is a little easier to answer this question. This is because many of the studies of the consequences of volunteering have used longitudinal designs that measure volunteering early in the research and then use differences in this behavior to predict subsequent feelings and behaviors. Furthermore, these studies employ sophisticated statistical techniques to control for other possible causes and explanations of the positive relationships found. Thus, we feel fairly confident in stating that volunteering seems to produce a host of benefits for the volunteer. At the same time, we must note that no one has yet explained why engaging in volunteering would necessarily make a person physically and psychologically healthier. What, for example, are the biological pathways from being a volunteer to better health? Until these pathways can be identified, we must entertain the possibility that both volunteering and the positive effects that follow could simply have some common cause. Investigating the consequences of volunteering seems to be an area in which collaborative efforts between social psychologists and sociologists interested in volunteering and more biologically inclined researchers could prove very productive. Turning to the final topic covered in this chapter, help seeking, the major question of interest was what variables affect people's reactions to assistance and willingness to ask for help. The general answer to this question is fairly straightforward. The characteristics of the person in need, the specific kind of assistance needed, and the relationship between one in need and the potential helper. Perhaps the most intriguing aspect of help seeking is that it does not always occur when a person is in trouble. That is, despite the material benefits that would almost certainly result from asking for help, e.g., relief from distress and pain, help with personal and professional problems, improved physical or psychological well-being, people often refrain from asking for help. A substantial number of different personal, social, and situational variables have been found to affect help seeking, but most of these variables appear to be related to help seeking in one common way. They affect the psychological costs of receiving unsolicited assistance or asking for help. Consider the relationship between the potential helper and the recipient. People in need do not request help from just anyone. Instead, they select individuals who can offer help to them at the minimum cost to their self-image and self-esteem. They may not select the person who could offer the most help most efficiently, but they may ask the person who can provide the help with the fewest psychological costs to themselves. If such a low-cost helper is not available, then people may refrain from asking for any help and simply go it alone. Alternatively, they may seek and accept help from another person, but then harbor negative feelings toward their benefactor because of the costs that they have to bear. One area in which these help-seeking findings would seem especially relevant is in interactions between people from different social groups or between the groups themselves. Prosocial exchanges between groups that differ racially or ethnically would seem to be a fairly obvious way to promote increased intergroup harmony, but of course, things are much more complicated than this. There are a multitude of factors that impede one group's willingness to ask another for aid, and still other factors that will affect reactions to the aid if it is given.